Hey guys, Mr. Epifano here, and
Noah.
all right, and we're going to be sitting here teaching you about ancient Rome. Let's start it off. All right, Rome is located in what country is Rome located in?
I think Italy.
Italy. There you go. Good job. Rome is located in Italy, and Italy is a peninsula, which means it's surrounded by water on three sides, just like we talked about Greece. All right. And to the south of Italy is a famous island called Sicily. And to the west of Italy is another famous island called La Sardegna. All right, so a little bit more about the geography of the physical geography of Italy is that to the north is this huge mountain range called the Alps. All right, beautiful place to vacation.
And Romans fight.
And Romans fight. All right. And then we got the Apennines, which run down the middle of Italy. All right, and then you can see all the green, which are the beautiful plains where they can farm and everything like that.
Knights are my favorite.
Knights are his favorite, folks. You heard it here. All right. Also to the south, we have some volcanoes. All right, some volcanoes which help shape.
Volcanoes explode.
Volcanoes explode. Thank you, Noah. All right, the volcanoes which shaped a lot of Italy.
And they explode lava.
They explode lava. All right. So Italy is a beautiful place to live, mainly because of its climate. All right. It has a very mild climate where it doesn't get too hot, doesn't get too cold, anything like that. It's amazing. All right. The hottest it gets in the summer is around 78. The coldest it gets in the winter is 46. So it is amazing. All right. We're going to focus on these two rivers right here, the Amo and the Tiber, which are the famous rivers where Rome settles around, especially closer to the Tiber there. Now, you know the reason why they settle around rivers. It's the same reason China settled around rivers. It's the same reason, let's see, India, all the Mesopotamia, all the rest of the ancient civilizations that we talked about that settle around rivers. Now let's get into it. The early history of the ancient Romans, where they originated and everything like that. So there was one guy named Virgil, all right, who was a Roman poet who told a story of a Trojan hero who comes over from Troy and starts the Roman civilization. We also have the more famous story of the twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, all right, which is a story of how these brothers were raised by a wolf. If you go to Rome now, you can see statues dedicated to them where it's two little babies underneath a wolf mother. All right. And these brothers had a quarrel, meaning a fight when they grew up, and they ended up killing each other. But the victor, actually, they dedicated a hill to him, which is where the rich people live, the patricians. All right. And where the younger brother, the loser of the brothers, they dedicated a hill to him for the poor people, the plebs. All right. So what historians actually do believe is that Neolithic people settled there. Remember, Neolithic is when farming first started around 5000 BC. All right, so a really long time ago. They built small farming villages. Okay. Now, and around 1000 BC, Latins came and settled that area, the area which they call Latium, but will later be called Rome. All right. Now we call them Latins because of the language that they spoke, which is the Latin. All right. Remember, we kind of mentioned this before. The Romans spoke Latin. Latin is the base root of the famous languages around the world. All right. Spanish, French, Italian. All right. A lot of Latin used in English as well. And then around 800 BC, the Greeks and Etruscans move into this region. Now, the Greeks had a huge impact on the country of Italy. All right. First, the Greeks introduced two huge new crops to the farming, which were grapes, which was used for eating, used for wine, everything like that. Also, the Greeks introduced the olive, which we get olive oil from, which became a major product also in Rome. The Greeks also gave the Latins the Greek alphabet, which really taught the Latins how to come up with their own writing and their own alphabet, which is the same alphabet that we use today. Also, in the Roman civilization, you can see a lot of the art and architecture that was passed from the Greeks, including the religion. So you'll notice that when you look at the pictures of Rome, they look like the same type of buildings in Greece, all right? And also the Roman gods, their whole religion is the same as the Greek religion, except they renamed the gods to which we actually use the Roman god names for our planets. For example, Zeus in Greece is the same god as Jupiter in Rome. Now, the civilization called the Etruscans that came over, which were very Greek, all right, they taught the Romans a lot of things, all the way from jewelry, metal, how to make weapons, everything like that. Taught them how to have an organized military, taught them how to build better houses. Now, Rome is located about 15 miles up the Tiber River, which, if you remember from the map before, all right, it was right around that huge river. The Tiber allowed for quick and efficient trading with the ports and the sea. And the sea, by the way, that it's attached to is the Mediterranean Sea. The city itself was situated on 7 steep hills, and there you can see the Palatine, the Aventine, all right, all the rest of the hills there. Now let's talk about my favorite thing to talk about with the Romans is the military, all right? In the early days of the Republic, the Romans fought like the Greeks, all right? They had the phalanx, they had spears, they had everything like that. They realized that a better strategy was to reorganize the phalanxes, though, into smaller groupings, all right, called cohorts. The only people who could be soldiers were male citizen landowners. They had to join the military for at least 6 years. Deserters or quitters of the military were executed. All right, so here we have a picture of how organized the military was. Each one of those red smaller bricks equals about 80 men, 150 in the first cohort. All right, centurions were about 59. Now, the difference is that a centurion was actually somebody who was in the military for life. They were a lead commander. They were always the Romans that you would see with their helmet here. All right, this is a centurion helmet, and you can see that they do have the red plume on top, and that's how you knew they were in charge. Now, the reason centurions had a red plume on their helmet was in the heat of battle, when it's all chaotic and thousands of men are hand fighting each other, sword fighting, everything like that. You can look around easily, spot that guy with the red thing on his head, and know that he is in charge, and that's who you should listen to. Now, the flags right here actually identify the different legions or the different armies of Rome and where they are from. All right. On one of the flags, you can see that it's the 8th Legion, and they're from Africa. All right. Another one is the 1st Legion, is from Italy. All right. So you can see here how organized the military was. Now, here's some examples of what a soldier would carry around from day to day. All right, going from left to right. Left, you have their famous sword, which is called a gladius, which is actually what I have here today that you can see. Now, the thing with the gladius, no, it's not sharp. I'm not cutting my hand. All right. Now, the thing with the gladius that you should know is that gladius is Latin for stabbing sword. Okay. Now, it was called a stabbing sword because here would not be sharp on a Roman sword. Only the tip of the sword would be pointy, hence why it's called stabbing sword, because that's how they used it. All right. Now, going to the right, you have the pilum, which is a spear that they would use in the phalanx, kind of like the Greeks. But also, the thing that was cool about the pilum was that you can throw it as well, kind of like a javelin. When you threw the pilum, and let's say it got stuck in the ground, an interesting fact is it was so hard to pull out of the ground. That way, like, if you throw it at your enemy and you miss, he can't pick it up and use it against you. All right. To the right is a scutum. Now, the scutum is a shield, but it's a lot bigger than the Greeks. All right. It's a Gallic scutum that the Romans actually stole that idea from some of their barbarian enemies that had bigger shields Now you can see with the scuttum that it covers most of the body, all right, below the knees and everything like that. All right, so you can see when they join the phalanx, the shield wall, that it would be be harder to get around. All right, and to the right, you can see their chest armor piece, which was called a lorica segmata. Now, the Romans were really the first ones to use this advanced armor plating. All right, and you can see there it's called segmata, which means segments. All right, metal segments, kind of like scales, like fish scales going around. All right, and this would be the inspiration for later knights and stuff like that. Now, the Republic was started in 509 BC when the Romans overthrew the Etruscan king Tarquin the Proud. They established a republic, a form of government in which citizens elect their leaders. We talked about this before. They are a representative democracy where citizens would vote for their leaders to be in the Senate, and the Senate would vote on laws and stuff like that. Thanks to the military strength, by 267 BC, the Romans controlled the majority of Italy. All right, SPQR, which in Latin is Senatus Populus Quiere Romanus, all right, which means the Senate and people of Rome. Now, we already talked a little bit about the government, but Romans formed what's called the Roman Confederation, which gave conquered people Roman citizenship, okay? Now, Roman citizenship allowed people to vote and serve in the Roman government. That's all you needed to do. Other conquered people were known as allies. They paid taxes, were required to supply troops to the Roman army and everything like that, but they couldn't vote or anything because they weren't full Roman citizens. All right, now the government was definitely divided. You have the patricians on one hand, which were wealthy landowners, and then you have the plebeians, who were artisans, shopkeepers, and farmers. All right, so rich and poor, basically. Patricians and plebeians were not allowed to marry each other. I know that sounds kind of rough, but remember, in the Roman days, marriage was not really about love. It was more of like a business contract and everything like that. Both served in the military, except for the most part, patricians would be generals, commanders, everything like that. All right, and plebeians would be the guys on the front lines. All right, so this is more of a breakdown of the Senate. You don't necessarily need to know this. Consuls were kind of like our president in the United States, where consuls were really like leaders, even though they didn't have all the power and everything like that. All right, they had the power of veto, which our president actually has today. And veto means I forbid it, which means if the Senate makes a law that the consul doesn't like, you could say veto, and that doesn't become a law. The Senate served a life term, which means as soon as they're elected in the Senate, they can be in the Senate as long as they want until the day they die. All right, and the assembly, which is a group of people from Rome, would get together and they would vote for consuls. And just as we said already, consuls, like I said, they were kind of served as like the president of the United States serves. All right. Now, someone called a praetor was a judge who it's their job to interpret the law. Now, what it means to interpret the law means to explain the law. Because once you write something down, what means, one thing to me means something else to somebody else. Like if I were to say to you, freedom of speech, what does freedom of speech mean to you? You're probably going to give a different answer than I would give, than your mom would give, your dad would give, brother would give, siblings would give. All right, everybody would have a different answer. So it is a praetor's job to say, this is the law, this is what it means. A tribune was an elected official who protects the rights of the ordinary citizen. All right. Now, they created some term that we interpret or we translate to civic duty, which is the idea that citizens have a responsibility to help their country. We have that same belief in the United States, that we believe that it's a citizen's job to help your country in one way or another. Like right now, during the quarantine, it is your civic duty to stay indoors to stop the virus from spreading. Now, a dictator was a person who was given absolute power. Now, this was an interesting tradition that the Romans had. If the city of Rome was under attack or was in trouble in some way, they would elect one person called a dictator to be in charge of the entire government and given absolute power of the military. Now, Cincinnatus became dictator to defend Rome, and after 16 days in power, he resigned and returned to his farm victorious, which is really interesting because they gave him power of an army, he had wealth, he had control of the entire government, and he was able to give up all that power and become a farmer again. So you ask, how did the Romans actually tell the rest of its citizens, right? It's not like they could sit there and Google it or anything like that. So the first thing they did was engrave them in bronze and display them in the Forum, which was in the main section of the government. These are known as the 12 tables, right? Rome also created a set of laws for places conquered outside of Rome known as the Law of Nations. So Romans had to follow a different law, but when they would conquer a place, there would be a new set of laws for that region. Kind of like if you think about in the United States, yeah, we have laws that have to deal with the entire country, but also we have state laws, like Florida has laws, New York has laws, New Jersey has laws. Now, the Romans came up with this cool concept, which was called innocent until proven guilty, veritas equitas, and the rule of law. What that meant is that if a person was accused of a crime, they had the right to a fair trial. Now, in the Roman days, Rome became very corrupt, all right, along with its trials and everything like that. So it was a nice idea, but in the United States, we have that idea for our court system, veritas equitas. All right, and then there's this idea of the rule of law, which no one is above the law, including the people who make the law. It's the same thing in the United States, all right? So we have a Senate and we have a president. If they break the law, they get in trouble just like you and I, right? And it was that way in ancient Rome as well. Let's talk about our first huge war, all right? The Punic Wars. Now, if you look on the map, all right, the Punic Wars were against Rome, which is right there in the purple, against a place called Carthage, which is that bright kind of yellow north of Africa, okay? Now, the Carthaginians were established by the Phoenicians. If you remember, we talked about the Phoenicians with the ancient Greeks, that they were famous sailors and traders. They made these amazing boats, the best boats in the ancient world. Carthage controlled northern Africa, southern Spain, and the islands of Corsica, Sardinia, and most of Sicily. All right, so the Romans were very familiar with Carthaginians because they were right next door to them. Now, this war lasted roughly around 120 years. Now, the first Punic War, all right, Rome invaded Sicily, which at that time was owned by Carthage. Carthage had a strong navy, that was their forte, and Rome had a strong army, which was their forte, all right? Now, the Romans had to kind of figure out a way, how do we beat them on sea if our ships aren't that good? So the Romans pretty much just built copycat ships of the Carthaginians and installed these small movable bridges. So basically what they did was they would take their ship, they would sail it right along a Carthaginian ship, they would put these planks down that were kind of like a bridge, and they would fight with their land tactics on the sea. Rome won the first Punic War, and they gained Sicily. Now, the Second Punic War was probably the most famous of all three Punic Wars, mostly because of this Carthaginian leader called Hannibal. All right, now Hannibal was this famous tactician from Carthage. He vowed to his father that he would avenge Carthage and defeat the Romans at any cost. And with this, Hannibal came up with using war elephants in his army, which the Romans had no way of defeating Hannibal with his war elephants. Now, a famous Roman by the name of Scipio captured southern Spain for Rome and then attacked Carthage itself. All right. Now, Hannibal, he thought, okay, well, I'm going to get back at them and I'm going to capture Rome. So Hannibal actually brings his army All right, now the Romans expect him to sail with their amazing navy, sail up north of Africa to Sicily, and then go from Sicily and march into Italy all the way up into Rome. Now Hannibal knew that's what they would expect him to do. So Hannibal took the Carthaginians and his elephants all the way around Spain to the north of the Alps, and he wanted to come south to Rome for a surprise attack. Now, unfortunately, the elephants did not do well traveling through the Alps, all right, and a lot of his elephants died because the Alps are freezing cold. A lot of his men died in the freezing cold, which actually goes to the Battle of Zama, which is where the Carthaginians gave up their entire navy and paid a huge fine to the Romans for their loss. Now, the Third Punic War is where Rome still considered Carthage a military threat, even though Carthaginians kind of gave up and they didn't care for the war anymore. The Romans just wanted to annihilate them. So Rome attacked and destroyed the entire city of Carthage. And on top of that, they burned Carthage to the ground. And legend has it is that they sowed, which means they planted salt in the farming fields of Carthage. That way, nobody would ever settle in that place again. Romans are pretty cruel. Now, after the Punic War, it was not a good time for the Romans because the soldiers who went off to fight the war, who owned farmlands and stuff, they came back to Rome not able to pay their taxes because they were fighting in a war, duh, all right? But their lands were taken away from them. So actually, Rome was overpopulated, it was dirty, it was filled with homeless people, all this stuff. All right, and this gave way to the wealthiest landowners who bought up the available farmland from the poorer farmers, all right, and used slaves to work on it. This meant that more people were out of work because they were using conquered Carthaginians as slaves. Brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus wanted to help the poor, and because they wanted to help the poor, their friends who were patricians actually ended up murdering them, all right? Now, General Gaius Marius was a popular war hero. He was famous for saying the law speaks too softly amidst the din of arms, all right? Which means laws don't mean anything when it comes to a person with a sword in your face. He changed the military from drafting type to a professionally paid army, which really helped the military, all right? That way, like if they go off the war and they come back, they actually have money. Recruited the poor from the streets of Rome because they didn't have jobs. They didn't have any other choice but to join the military. Now, this guy, Gaius Marius, like I said, he was a general, very wealthy. He started the first professional, which means paid army in the ancient world, which means they probably loved this guy because they were paying him. So they didn't care about Roman laws or the Senate and everything like that. And Gaius Marius took control. All right. Now, Lucius Cornelius Sulla was no friend ever served me, and no enemy never wronged me, whom I have not repaid in full. That is a little quote about revenge. He was a rival general of Marius, and Rome ended up being in a civil war. A civil war is a war where Romans fight Romans. All right. We had a civil war in the United States where Americans fought Americans. Sulla did end up winning. Looked like a hero, gave senators more power, and reduced the power of those who would become generals and dictators. Now, coming and stemming from that with Crassus is the first triumvirate. A triumvirate is when there is pretty much three people. All right. Now, these three famous people that we'll talk about right now were known as the three-headed monster. All right. Crassus, Caesar, that's Julius Caesar, and Pompey. Each one of them pretended to be friends, but they actually hated each other. Now, Julius Caesar and Pompey were both younger than Crassus and were brutal rivals because both Julius Caesar and Pompey were successful generals in the Roman military. When Crassus was killed in battle, the fragile truce was fractured, and Caesar was told to surrender his armies in Gaul. So Imagine this. Julius Caesar wanted to be more popular than Pompey. So Julius Caesar takes his army and he takes them into what they call Gaul, which is pretty much France nowadays. All right, and Julius Caesar starts this war for no reason to look like this Roman hero. Now, Julius Caesar, because of his victories in Gaul, actually did become very famous. The people loved him, and he became very rich. Pompey was jealous living back in Rome, and he actually got the Senate to declare Julius Caesar an enemy of Rome. And from this sparked a war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Now, Caesar ultimately drives Pompey out of Rome and defeats his armies in battle. Pompey tries to escape to Egypt, but once he's in Egypt, because he's a pretty famous dude, he is actually murdered and assassinated and is served his head as a gift to Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar becomes the sole leader of Rome. Now, Julius Caesar forced the Senate to make him dictator. Remember, we talked about the dictator before. Made him a dictator for life. And Julius Caesar ruled as a king. Even though he didn't call himself a king, he pretty much was a king. Julius Caesar wasn't that bad. He created new buildings, new architecture, new temples. He gave more money to the poor. All right, the poor loved him. But the rich absolutely did not like him. Now, beware the Ides of March, all right, which is famous from a Shakespearean play about this event in Julius Caesar's life, all right, which is March 15th. On March 15th, Julius Caesar was actually assassinated on the Senate floor and was stabbed over 20 times. This led to the second triumvirate in Rome. Now, in the second triumvirate of Rome, you have these three characters, which were Octavian, who is the son of Julius Caesar, actually the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Octavian is actually his nephew, but according to Roman law, he can adopt his nephew as his own son because he did not have a son himself. Then we have the famous character of Mark Antony, who is the former co-consul and friend of Julius Caesar, and then Lepidus, who was also a friend of Julius Caesar. These three joined together on a mission of revenge for Julius Caesar, and they hunted down everyone who actually betrayed and assassinated Julius Caesar. Now, once the tasks had been completed, Lepidus retired. He did not want power anymore. Mark Antony began a relationship with the Queen of Egypt, known as Cleopatra, which is actually a famous story between them. Mark Antony and Octavian became jealous of each other. They wanted to be the sole person in charge of Rome, kind of like Julius Caesar and Pompey, the same thing. They started another civil war. Now, Mark Antony lost his war in Egypt, and Mark Antony became crazy, and he ended up committing suicide. Now, his love of his life, Cleopatra, actually is so sad that she just lost her loved one that she decides, kind of like Romeo and Juliet, she decides to kill herself as well. She takes a poisonous snake and lets the poisonous snake bite her. And Octavian becomes the sole ruler. And Octavian changes his name to Augustus Caesar, which Augustus means the majestic one. And he becomes the first emperor of Rome. Now, he was an amazing leader. He was so amazing that he started what's called the Pax Romana. Pax meaning peace, Romana meaning Rome, which means Roman peace. And it lasted for 200 years, which means they were not at war for a whole 200 years. And guys, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. This was my first one. All right, so bear with me on this. I definitely miss you guys. All right, stay safe.